Good morning, Prof. and fellow classmates. My name is Alvinder Singh, and today I'll be discussing on Chapter 2 of the book Return of Depression Economics and the 2008 Financial Crisis by Paul Krugman. The chapter is titled Warning Ignored Latin America's Crisis. So before we dive into the content, I would just like to provide a brief overview of the chapter so that you can follow my presentation and draw links more easily. The main focus is on the tequila crisis of 1995 in Mexico and Argentina, and its relevance to the 2008 financial crisis. This will be the timeline of the presentation. Okay, so let's begin with the discussion of the Mexican and Argentinian economies pre-tequila crisis. So in Mexico, much like the other countries in Latin America, the debt crisis of 1982 saw Mexico dive into a recession. However, the 1980s was a period of financial change in Mexico. When Carlos Salinas took over in 1988, he strengthened the economy by resolving the surmountable amount of debt they had through negotiations with the USA, and he also established a North American Free Trade Agreement, also known as NAFTA, in 1990. This allowed free trade to flourish, and Mexico began to remove strict import restrictions as well. This resulted in positive sentiment towards investments in Mexico, and in 1993, the country also saw a $30 billion investment from foreign capital into Mexico. Argentina was also in a financial slump in the 1980s, facing true hyperinflation that saw an inflation rate of 3,000% annually. However, things drastically changed when Domingo Cavallo was made finance minister in 1988. Much like Salinas in Mexico, he introduced revolutionary policies. He opened Argentina to the world markets, privatized the country's inefficient state-owned sectors as well. He then introduced an unorthodox form of monetary policy, which was the currency board, where the peso was pegged at a rate of 1:1. The results were very impressive. Inflation rate fell nearly to zero, and there was a resumption of capital inflow, and real GDP increased by 25% in 3 years. However, despite the euphoria from investors and the strong sentiment in the market in Mexico, 1994 was a year that should have acted as a warning of some impending doom approaching for the region once again, which was subsequently ignored. Two main points of concern lingered in the hearts of some. The first was the overvalued peso, and the second was the extremely slow growth rate in America. Okay, so now let's talk about the tequila crisis itself, which was a period of severe financial crisis in Mexico that started in December 1994. So how did the tequila crisis occur? This was due to a steady drain on foreign reserves of the Mexican government. The government had to devalue the currency in hopes to make exports more competitive. However, they had botched the job. The devaluation was 15% of what was recommended, and the Mexican government was arrogant and indifferent in face of such a calamity. This did not help to boost consumer confidence, and in fact led to an even greater sell-off of the peso. Rapid change in market sentiment occurred as well, resulting in massive capital flight. Foreign investors wanted out at any cost, resulting in the value of the peso falling to half its pre-crisis level. There were severe effects on the Mexican economy, such as the real GDP plunging by 7% and industrial production plunging by 15%. Thousands of businesses went bankrupt, hundreds and thousands of workers lost their jobs as well. So how was Argentina affected by Mexico's mistakes despite being on opposite poles of the continent? Basically, all Latin American countries looked the same to foreign investors. Capital flight occurred similar to in Mexico, and people reduced their money. Businesses also struggled to pay off their loans, leading to more fear from depositors, which in turn started pulling money from banks. A vicious credit crunch ensued. The currency board did not provide the insulation it hoped for, because it prevented the central bank from being a lender of last resort due to the inability to print more pesos. This brought Argentina banks to the edge of collapse due to investor sentiment of fear and the need to change large amount of US dollars for pesos. So with the economies of Argentina under immense pressure, intervention was needed to ensure a total collapse would be avoided. So what did Argentina and Mexico need urgently? They needed a substantial amount of US dollars. This is to solve their debt problem. So who provided it to them? The provision of the US dollars came separately. Mexico was saved by a 15 billion USD credit line provided by the US Treasury, while Argentina's rescue came via the World Bank. They provided US $12 billion to support the nation. By late 1995, things were stabilizing. This funding caused investors to relax, interest rates to come down, and spending to revive. The crisis was over as soon as it started, however, with painful long-term effects still lingering. Despite the horrific effects on businesses and livelihood of many, there were various lessons to be learned. However, some were not the right ones. We will first begin by looking at the wrong lessons, the takeaways that eventually led and contributed to the '08 financial crisis. The first was that the crisis was not a cause of concern because it was solely a Mexican mistake in policy formation, whereon economies such as the US economy and the Japanese economy were not susceptible to these problems. The second was that the IMF and the US Treasury were competent to handle even more severe financial crises if they were to arise, the evidence being the mobilization of quick aid that had saved Mexico. Clearly, these takeaways were false, as we examine later in other chapters of the book. Now we move on to the takeaways that could have potentially helped mitigate the '08 financial crisis explained by Krugman. So the first is that what happened in Mexico could have happened elsewhere, and the admiration of the markets was no guarantee for immunity to financial crisis. Also, there was far too much credit given to Washington, to the IMF, and to the Treasury. The situation will be very difficult, as we see in subsequent chapters as well, when attempting to resolve conflicts with other economies, such as Asian economies, which argue from a point of power. In conclusion, these are just some personal takeaways. Market sentiment is extremely volatile and unpredictable. We should always prepare for the worst case scenario and learn from mistakes of the past to prepare ourselves for the future. Complacency and arrogance from financial institutions and figureheads could prove costly to world economies as well. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed my presentation.